The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have long been advocating for reforms in global economic frameworks, particularly the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. These nations argue that the existing structures disproportionately benefit wealthy, industrialized nations while failing to address the economic realities and priorities of the global South. In their view, the IMF's quota system and the WTO's dispute resolution process need to be adjusted to better reflect the growing influence of emerging economies. At the heart of the BRICS agenda is a demand for greater representation and fairness in these institutions. They believe that the IMF's current policies favor developed nations and often impose harsh conditions on developing countries in exchange for financial support. These conditions, according to critics, have led to severe economic consequences for many nations that have had to rely on IMF loans, with some experiencing political unrest, social instability, and economic downturns as a result. This widespread dissatisfaction with the IMF is at the forefront of calls for reform within the global South, and some countries are even exploring the possibility of creating alternative financial institutions to serve their interests. In this video, we delve into some of the countries in the global South that have suffered due to IMF lending practices and the economic reforms enforced by the fund. These stories highlight the significant social and economic challenges that arise when nations are forced to comply with policies set by international financial institutions, often at the expense of their citizens' well-being. Egypt's 1977 bread riots. In January 1977, Egypt found itself grappling with significant social unrest, triggered by an economic decision that would dramatically affect the country's working class. The government, led by President Anwar Sadat, opted to cut subsidies on essential food products like bread, sugar, rice, and cooking oil. This move was made to secure a loan from the IMF, but the decision had disastrous consequences. The abrupt price hikes sparked widespread protests, known as the bread riots, which spread across Egypt's major cities, including Cairo, Alexandria, and Suez. The protests began in industrial areas like Helwan, where workers initiated strikes. Soon, students and ordinary citizens joined in, rallying against the government and its economic policies. The unrest escalated when demonstrators attacked symbols of authority, including police stations and luxury hotels. Public transportation was also targeted, resulting in extensive property damage. In response, President Sadat deployed the military to restore order, leading to violent clashes between the armed forces and protesters. Official reports indicated that 80 people were killed, more than 550 were injured, and around 1,200 people were arrested. Eventually, under mounting pressure, the Egyptian government reversed its decision and reinstated the subsidies, stabilizing the situation. This incident remains a stark example of the consequences of IMF-imposed austerity measures on a nation's population. Brazil's economic crisis and IMF intervention. In the late 1990s, Brazil found itself in the midst of a severe economic crisis. In an attempt to stabilize its currency and economy, the Brazilian government turned to the IMF for assistance. In November 1998, the IMF approved a $41.5 billion loan package for Brazil, with the condition that the country implement stringent austerity measures and structural reforms aimed at reducing fiscal deficits. The required austerity measures included significant cuts in public spending, tax increases, and public sector reforms. These policies led to reductions in essential public services like healthcare, education, and social security. The immediate effect was a decline in the quality and accessibility of these services, which disproportionately affected the poor and vulnerable populations. Public outcry was swift, with widespread protests and strikes erupting across the country. Citizens and labor unions voiced their opposition, arguing that the IMF's conditions were exacerbating poverty and inequality in Brazil. While some analysts argue that the austerity measures and reforms helped stabilize Brazil's economy by controlling hyperinflation and restoring investor confidence, the social costs were severe. The country's long-term economic stability was achieved, But the short-term impact on its citizens was significant. In 2005, Brazil repaid its IMF loans early, a move that many saw as evidence of the country's regained financial autonomy. However, the debate over the effectiveness of these IMF-imposed reforms continues, with critics questioning whether the economic stabilization was worth the social sacrifices. Morocco's 1981 bread riots. Morocco, facing severe economic challenges in the late 1970s, entered into an agreement with the IMF in 1981 to receive financial assistance. As part of the deal, the Moroccan government, under King Hassan II, was required to implement austerity measures, including the reduction of subsidies on essential food items such as flour, sugar, oil, and milk. The sudden price increases sparked widespread protests, most notably the Casablanca bread riots of May 29, 1981. The protests were primarily led by residents from impoverished neighborhoods who took to the streets to protest the rising cost of living. They targeted symbols of wealth, such as banks, pharmacies, and luxury vehicles. The government responded with force, deploying military and police units to suppress the protests. Official reports stated that 66 people were killed, but opposition sources claim the death toll was much higher, with many victims being young individuals from the slums. The events in Morocco underscored the tension between the economic reforms imposed by the IMF and the social realities of a population that was heavily reliant on subsidized goods. The violent suppression of the protests highlighted the fragility of political stability when austerity measures are introduced without considering the broader social impact. The aftermath of the riots left a lasting political and social impact on Morocco, marking a significant moment in the country's history of IMF-imposed reforms. Nigeria's Structural Adjustment Program. In the mid-1980s, Nigeria found itself in the grip of a severe economic downturn. The country faced plummeting oil prices, rising external debt, and dwindling foreign reserves. In response, the government, led by General Ibrahim Babangida, implemented a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in collaboration with the IMF. The program aimed to reduce Nigeria's dependence on oil exports, promote non-oil sectors, and achieve fiscal stability. The policies associated with SAP included the devaluation of the naira, which led to skyrocketing inflation and the rising cost of imported goods and essential commodities. The removal of subsidies further increased living costs, disproportionately affecting low-income households. The resulting economic hardship sparked protests, most notably the anti-SAP riots of 1989. The protests began with students at the University of Benin and quickly spread to other cities, including Lagos and Ibadan. Demonstrators, many of them chanting anti-government slogans, were met with a heavy military response, resulting in casualties and arrests. While some argue that SAP was necessary for Nigeria's long-term economic stability, the immediate social costs were profound. The austerity measures led to increased unemployment, a decline in public services, and a rise in poverty and inequality. The violent suppression of protests further destabilized the political environment, eroding public trust in the government and contributing to the political unrest of the late 1980s. Venezuela's economic crisis and IMF recommended austerity. Venezuela's economic crisis in the late 1980s serves as another example of the consequences of IMF-imposed austerity measures. In 1989, President Carlos Andrés Pérez, facing a severe economic downturn characterized by declining oil revenues and mounting external debt, implemented a series of austerity measures as recommended by the IMF. These measures, collectively known as El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn, aim to stabilize the economy by implementing structural reforms. The sudden implementation of these measures, which included fuel price hikes and cuts to subsidies, led to widespread discontent. On February 27, 1989, protests erupted in the city of Caracas, sparking violent clashes between demonstrators and security forces. The protests, initially triggered by the hike in fuel prices, quickly grew to encompass broader grievances about the economic conditions imposed by the government. The violence led to a significant loss of life and further deepened the political instability in Venezuela. Venezuela's experience during the 1989 protests serves as a stark reminder of the potential dangers of implementing IMF-backed reforms without sufficient consideration of the social impact. The government's response to the protests, marked by military force and widespread repression, left a lasting legacy of political unrest and distrust in the government. Conclusion: the examples of Egypt, Brazil, Morocco, Nigeria, and Venezuela illustrate the often dire consequences of IMF-imposed austerity measures and structural adjustments. While these measures may be seen as necessary for stabilizing economies in the short term, the social and political costs can be devastating. These case studies highlight the tension between the economic reforms advocated by international financial institutions and the realities faced by the populations of developing countries. The Global South's growing dissatisfaction with the IMF